Hi everyone, this is Molly Moss, and my project is titled Merlin Through the Ages. And I will be taking a look at different works that feature Merlin throughout different centuries and seeing how he has transformed in each story. So, when most people think of Merlin today, people think of an old wise man with a long white beard and robes. But in his earliest appearances, he is instead a wild man with a demon father and a Christian princess mother. In the beginning, Merlin's earliest appearance comes from Geoffrey of Monmouth in the 12th century in a book called The Prophecies of Merlin. When Merlin was just a child, King Vortigern witnesses a white and a red dragon fighting. After watching the red dragon defeat the white dragon, he returns to Merlin and asks, "What does it mean?" And Merlin responds, weeping, quote, "Alas for the red dragon, the day of his extermination is fast approaching. His lair will be occupied by the white dragon, who is none other than the Saxons who you have invited. The red dragon represents British people, who will be crushed by the white one. Mountains will be made level with valleys, and the rivers of the valley will be flooded with blood. Religion will be destroyed and bare. Ruined churches will dot the nation. Nevertheless, in the end, the downtrodden people will triumph over the oppressors who came from abroad. The wild boar of Cornwall will come to the assistance and trample the necks of oppressors under his feet. All the British Isles will be brought under his dominion, and he will control the groves of Gaul as well. The house of Romulus will tremble at his rage, and he will have a dubious departure in the end. The mouths of multitudes will celebrate his praises, and his triumphs will whet the appetite of poets." End quote. It is believed by many that the wild boar of Cornwall is in fact King Arthur. It is his vision that we start to get a sense of the power Merlin holds. Geoffrey writes, quote, "All were amazed at his knowledge and knew there was something supernatural about him. There was no one else in the kingdom with greater skill in fortune-telling the future." End quote. So thanks to his otherworldly father, he is able to prophesize the future and see into the past. He can communicate and control animals. He can fly and shapeshift and could predict the motion of the stars. Geoffrey goes on to talk about Merlin bringing stones over from Ireland to create the Stonehenge, with the use of magic and his role in the conception of Arthur. He helps Uther Pendragon deceive the wife of the Duke of Cornwall into sleeping with him. He does this by basically having Uther shapeshift. This is the closest Merlin gets to King Arthur in Geoffrey's stories. By the end of the 12th century, there is a general consensus that Merlin is able to perform this magic due to him being demonic. His father's side is what gives him such great power throughout his life. He was not a prophet due to a Christian reason, but a demonic one. Now, let's shoot up to the 13th century. At the start of the 13th century, French poet Robert de Baron sets out to rework the stories of Merlin and King Arthur into a more Christian story of the Holy Grail. He wrote a 3-part epic beginning with Joseph of Arimathea about the early history of the Grail, continuing with Merlin about the founding of the Round Table, and concluding with Percival about the quest for the Holy Grail. These stories are a direct spin-off of Geoffrey's work, but Baron reworked the stories to bring out his Christian morals. Instead of just using an otherworldly prophet, he is written as a prankster, a shapeshifter, and a player of practical jokes with an errand from God to teach men that they are incapable of distinguishing good from evil. They must distrust their faulty human reason and submit to God's will. One example of Merlin's shape-shifting and playing jokes on those around him comes when he meets Uther Pendragon for the first time. He learns that Uther is looking for him, and so he travels to a local village where Uther's men are located. He disguises himself as a woodcutter, a great axe on his shoulder and great boots on his feet. He was dressed in a short coat that was all torn. He had long hair standing all on end, and he wore a great beard. He looked very much like a wild man. So this is yet another example of Merlin being able to shapeshift. This causes Uther's men to assume he is an evil man and is hesitant to talk to him. Merlin continues to hide his identity when he talks with the men and pretends to be a messenger for himself, and this catches Uther's men' attention. Beren writes, quote, "Messengers listened carefully to what Merlin said, but when he finished, he turned around, and in turning, he disappeared." So here we have Merlin able to basically disappear within thin air, another sign of how magical he was. The men do not catch on that this is Merlin and continue to think he is the devil. It wasn't until they went back to Uther and recounted the tale that they started to make the connection that the old and ugly messenger from before was actually Merlin. Beren keeps the backstory that Merlin is conceived by a Christian mother, that's a virgin, and a demon, but he is saved of becoming the Antichrist thanks to his mother's virtue. We learn that he has been, quote, "elected by God to perform a service that none but he can perform, since no other being knows what he knows," end quote. This would be to orchestrate the quest for the Holy Grail. Other Christian changes Beren made include telling Arthur to create the round table as a replica of the table from the Last Supper. Like in Joffrey's story, he helps Uther conceive Arthur, but in his poem Merlin, he takes Arthur away to keep him safe and to educate him and prepare him to pull the sword from the stone and be anointed king. In the poem Percival, Merlin's attention shifts from King Arthur to Lord Percival, and with his guidance, he leads him to finding the Holy Grail. So it was thanks to Robert de Baron that Merlin shifted from a wizard with demonic roots, with no connection to religion, to a wizard led by God to help guide King Arthur. It wasn't his demonic father that necessarily gave him the powers. It was his savior mother and his glory to God that allowed it to happen. So now we're going to shoot forward a bit and take a look at Merlin in the 20th century. There's been many works dedicated to Merlin and King Arthur in the 20th century, including poems and stories by Ralph Waldo Emerson and C.S. Lewis. I want to take a look at Arthur Mary Stuart and her successful attempt at making Merlin appear more human. She attempts to make Merlin as credible as a human rather than making him the traditional enchanter as seen in earlier works like Baron and Joffrey, or by presenting him as a commonplace wizard of modern-day fantasy. She does this by making the world Merlin and King Arthur belong in as realistic as possible and by giving them emotions and experiences that the reader can understand and relate to. She uses concrete details that are both photographically exact and yet at the same time poetically evocative. One way she makes Merlin more human-like is by taking away the earliest tradition that Merlin is the son of a demon by introducing us to a human father in her first novel, The Crystal Cave. She also takes away the magic he uses to create Stonehenge. Uther tells Merlin he has powers and is magical after being able to move the giant stones when others have failed. Merlin responds to Uther saying, quote, "My mathematics are better, that is all," end quote. So instead of it being magic, he just uses math. She also addresses Merlin bringing Uther to the queen's bed in order for Arthur to be conceived. Unlike earlier stories where Arthur used magic to completely transform Uther, Merlin's plan was to simply, quote, "disguise Uther, Ulfin, and himself to pass. If we were seen as gorgeous and his companion servant, end quote. He did this by dressing them in the king's robes, dyeing Uther's beard, and placing a bandage over his face. He states to the queen months later that there was absolutely no magic in the ruse that helped create Arthur. So he uses traditional tricks that we would see in the modern 20th century to trick the queen instead of using magic. It is important to note that Stuart didn't take away all of Merlin's magic. In the story, a lot of Merlin's magic is a result of superstition. Stuart understands that during the time of King Arthur, people would blame magic for things that they cannot understand. For example, when Merlin creates Stonehenge, even though he is able to rationally explain how he did it, it is the magical element that people remember and thus builds a legend around him. Merlin also will have clairvoyant dreams, but these visions are almost always taking place in private. So any magic he does display or might have, it's not the magic that the people around him are seeing. So for example, during the Crystal Cave, Merlin explains a dream he has where he can see he is taking care of the future Arthur. Stuart writes, quote, "I stepped out onto the landing and the light from the guard room came after me, firelight and shadow. It is Marcia. I saw the tears glisten on her cheeks as she bent her head over what lay in her arms, a child, wrapped warm against the winter night. Take care of him, she said, and through the shines of her tear I saw treads of the stairway outline themselves again behind her." End quote. Merlin explains his ability to see things in the future by saying it is the voice of God speaking through him. Stuart has found a way of bringing in a supernatural element into the story while keeping Merlin himself human. She has made him an agent for something else that is genuinely supernatural. So instead of being magical because of a demonic father, he is magical because God is giving him these powers to speak through him. Now I wanted to look into the 21st century, but I won't go into too much detail about Merlin in our current century, but I think it is important to acknowledge that the interest people have in him is ongoing. For example, there is a successful TV show titled Merlin that ran for 5 seasons in 2008, and it chronicles young Merlin and his interactions with Arthur. It's pretty good. He is even referenced in the popular Harry Potter series as being one of the most important wizards of all time. You'll often hear them say Merlin's beard. And a little fun fact, he is a Slytherin. While Merlin has gone through many transformations, he has remained a powerhouse in Arthurian folklore. He is more than an old man. He is a demon, a magician for God, and a human. So even though Merlin is often seen as this old man and guide to King Arthur, when reflecting on stories throughout the centuries, it is obvious that Merlin is so much more. He is gone from being a demonic wizard to a magical servant of God that leads Arthur to find the Holy Grail, to a young man whose magical abilities is God speaking through him. Well, that's it for my final project. I hope you learned something new and enjoyed what I had to say, and maybe even go back and look up the stories that were mentioned here today. I could go on and on about how wonderful and amazing Merlin is, but I think these stories do a really great job at showing the different types of Merlin that there have been. Well, that's all, and bye.